The
Good evening,
business
sir.
summit hall held
Good evening.
its breath.
We appreciate your respect.
Jackson Smith, the most quietly feared man in the international underworld, had just been greeted by a temporary waitress, not in English, not in Italian, in a Sicilian dialect that hadn't been spoken outside of a bloodline everyone believed was dead. The old man's silver-haired head lifted slowly, his eyes, dark, sharp, impossibly knowing, fixed on the young woman trembling before him. She thought she was nobody. She thought she was just hired help. She was wrong, because in that single respectful greeting, Lakeisha had revealed something impossible. She carried the voice of ghosts Jackson Smith tried to bury 50 years ago. Don Thomas, the tattooed enforcer's son standing behind his father, moved his hand toward his concealed weapon. Every bodyguard in the room went rigid. The air turned to ice. In that moment, Jackson realized this wasn't just a waitress. She was living proof that the past never truly dies. And she was the only one who could unlock secrets he swore would stay buried forever. But to understand how one sentence froze men who ruled cities, we need to go back 6 hours, to when Lakeisha was just another invisible face in a world that would never remember her name. The grand ballroom of the Continental Summit Center smelled of aged leather, imported cologne, and money so old it didn't need to announce itself. Lakeisha wiped down a marble countertop in the staff preparation corridor, keeping her movements small, deliberate, forgettable. At 28, she had learned the art of disappearing in plain sight. She wore her brown hair pulled back in a practical bun that made her look older than her years, and her simple black vest over a white shirt marked her as what she was: temporary help, hired through an agency, cheap, replaceable, disposable. Listen up. Marcus, the event coordinator, clapped his hands sharply. He was a man who treated anxiety like a competitive sport, and tonight he was going for gold. His designer suit was already wrinkled from nervous fidgeting, and a sheen of sweat made his forehead glisten under the fluorescent lights. This is not a wedding. This is not a corporate retreat. This is the International Business Summit, Marcus hissed, his eyes scanning the line of servers like a drill sergeant inspecting troops. The people in that hall own shipping ports, construction empires, and politicians. They do not want conversation. They do not want eye contact. They want you to be furniture. He stopped in front of Lakeisha, his nostrils flaring. You. Water service only. Sparkling, still, and ice. Nothing else. Do not speak unless directly addressed. Do not linger at tables. Do not, under any circumstances, acknowledge anything you might overhear. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Lakeisha whispered. Her voice was so soft it barely registered above the industrial hum of the kitchen ventilation. That was intentional. Everything about her was intentional. The way she stood with her shoulders slightly hunched, the way she avoided prolonged eye contact, the way she made herself small enough to be overlooked. Marcus moved on, barking orders at the other servers. Lakeisha returned to polishing water pitchers, her hands steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. She didn't belong in a place like this. The summit hall beyond those service doors was a cathedral of wealth. Towering marble columns that reached toward vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than her annual rent, and floors buffed to such a high shine you could see your reflection mocking you. First time working one of these? Asked Elena, an older server with kind eyes and hands weathered from decades of carrying trays. Lakeisha nodded. Yeah, the agency called this morning. Emergency replacement. Figures, Elena muttered, adjusting her own uniform. Nobody wants these gigs. Too tense. Too many people who think a waitress is somewhere between furniture and livestock. Lakeisha managed a weak smile, but she didn't disagree. She'd worked enough catering events to know the type. Men in suits worth 5 figures who spoke to servers without looking at their faces, who left tips that were either insultingly small or condescendingly large, who treated service workers like NPCs in a video game, there to fulfill a function, then forgotten. But she needed the money. Her rent was late. Again. "Hey," Elena said softly, her expression shifting to something more serious. "You hear anything unusual tonight? And I mean anything. You pretend you didn't. You see anything odd, you forget it the second your shift ends. These people, they're not like the wedding crowds or the charity galas. Understand?" A chill traced down Lakeisha's spine. "What do you mean?" Elena glanced toward the service entrance, lowering her voice even further. The summit's official story is international trade and legitimate business partnerships, but half of the men in that hall have lawyers on speed dial for reasons that have nothing to do with contracts. Before Lakeisha could respond, Marcus reappeared, his face now drained of color. "They're arriving. The Smith delegation. Everyone to positions, now!" The kitchen went silent. Even the line cooks stopped their prep work. The only sound was the soft hiss of a gas burner and the distant murmur of conversation from the summit hall. Lakeisha picked up her water pitcher, a crystal piece that probably cost more than her car, and took her position near the service entrance. Through the narrow window in the swinging door, she could see the hall filling with men in expensive suits, their conversations muted, their body language radiating controlled power. And then the energy shifted.
It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but every person in that hall felt it. The main entrance doors opened and Jackson Smith entered. He didn't walk, he commanded space. In his late 60s, Jackson moved with the careful dignity of a man who had earned respect through decades of calculated decisions. His silver hair was swept back from a face that carried the weight of secrets no one dared ask about. He wore a black suit, tailored, understated, but unmistakably expensive, and his dark eyes swept the room with the kind of awareness that came from a lifetime of watching for threats. Behind him walked Don Thomas Smith. Where Jackson was composed and controlled, Don Thomas was intensity barely contained. Younger, broad-shouldered, with a charcoal suit that couldn't quite hide the tattoos crawling up his neck and onto his hands. His dark hair was styled back, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, sharp, predatory, scanned every corner, every exit, every face. Around them, a wall of bodyguards in crisp blue suits formed a protective perimeter. They moved with military precision, their expressions blank, their hands never far from the bulges beneath their jackets. The summit guests parted without being asked. Conversations didn't stop, but they lowered. Men who moments before had been laughing and networking now stood a little straighter, smiled a little less. Lakeisha watched through the service window, her breath catching. She'd served at enough events to recognize power when she saw it, but this was different. Jackson Smith didn't demand attention, he simply absorbed it. The entire room reoriented around his presence like planets adjusting to a gravitational pull. "Dear God," Marcus whispered beside her, his hands shaking as he adjusted his tie. "He actually came. I thought his people were bluffing." "Who is he?" Lakeisha asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Marcus looked at her like she'd just asked what oxygen was. "Jackson Smith controls half the shipping infrastructure on the East Coast. Officially, he's a legitimate businessman. Import, export, construction contracts, real estate development." Marcus paused, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Unofficially, let's just say if you want something moved across international waters without customs asking questions, you go to Jackson Smith, and if Jackson says no, you don't ask twice." Lakeisha's stomach tightened. "And his son? Don Thomas?" Marcus's hands trembled as he gripped his clipboard. "He's the enforcer, the fixer, the one who makes problems disappear. There are rumors, just rumors, but people say if you cross the Smith family, Don Thomas is the last face you see. Lakeisha swallowed hard. Through the window, she watched Jackson take his seat at the central table, the position of honor, the table that commanded a view of the entire hall. Don Thomas remained standing behind his father's right shoulder, his posture that of a guardian, a protector, a silent threat. "All right, people," Marcus announced, his voice cracking with stress. "Service begins in 5 minutes. Remember, you are invisible, you are efficient, you do not exist beyond the function you serve. And for the love of God, if Jackson Smith or his son addresses you, you answer with 'yes, sir,' and nothing else." Lakeisha nodded, gripping her water pitcher tighter. She told herself the same thing she told herself at every event like this. Keep your head down, do your job, go home. You're nobody to these people. But as she pushed through the service entrance and stepped into the marble cathedral of wealth and whispered threats, Lakeisha felt something she couldn't explain. A pull, an instinct. The same inexplicable sensation she'd felt as a child when her grandmother would grasp her small hands and make her repeat phrases in a language that sounded like music and memory braided together. "Never forget where you come from, Piccolania," her grandmother would whisper, her weathered face serious, almost afraid. "Never forget the words, even when you don't understand, especially when you don't understand." Lakeisha promised. She'd memorized every prayer, every greeting, every phrase her grandmother taught her in that strange, ancient dialect. And then her grandmother died, taking her secrets to a grave Lakeisha couldn't afford to mark with anything more than a simple stone. For 10 years, that language had lived in Lakeisha's memory, unused, irrelevant to her life of overdue bills and agency temp work. Until tonight. Because as Lakeisha approached Jackson Smith's table, water pitcher in hand, her heart pounding with the kind of fear that comes from being seen when you've spent a lifetime learning to disappear, Lakeisha realized her grandmother's words were about to matter, more than she could possibly imagine. What Lakeisha didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the greeting she was about to speak would freeze a room full of the most dangerous men in the international underworld. She didn't know that Jackson Smith had spent 50 years believing a certain bloodline was extinct, and she didn't know that her grandmother's irrelevant dialect was about to expose a truth powerful men had buried beneath decades of silence. If you want to see what happens when the past refuses to stay buried, when one waitress speaks words that shouldn't exist, then hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story is about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in any room isn't a gun. It's the truth spoken in a language ghosts carry. Now let's see exactly how Lakeisha's world changed forever.
Lakeisha's reflection in the staff room mirror looked exactly how she needed it to, forgettable. She pulled her brown hair tighter, feeling the familiar ache at her temples as the bun formed. Good. The discomfort kept her focused, kept her small. The black vest fit loosely over her white shirt, deliberately chosen 2 sizes too large so her body became shapeless, unremarkable. She'd learned years ago that curves attracted attention, and attention meant questions she couldn't afford to answer. Through the preparation room doorway, the Continental Summit Center stretched like a monument to everything she would never be. Marble columns rose toward ceilings she had to crane her neck to see. Chandeliers scattered light across floors so polished they looked wet. Men in suits that cost more than her rent moved through the space like they owned the oxygen itself. "You're new." Marcus appeared beside her, clipboard clutched like a shield. "Agency sent you?" "Yes, sir. Lakeisha, water service." He didn't look at her face. Good. That meant she was doing it right. "You speak when spoken to. You pour with your right hand, never reach across a guest. You do not, under any circumstances, interrupt conversations, make eye contact for longer than 2 seconds, or acknowledge anything you overhear. You're furniture with a pulse. Understand?" "Yes, sir." The words came automatically, the same script she'd performed at a dozen venues just like this. country clubs, corporate galas, fundraisers where women wore diamonds worth more than Lakeisha would earn in a lifetime. She'd learned to move through those spaces like air, necessary but invisible. Her studio apartment waited for her tonight, if she could still call it hers. The eviction notice had given her until Friday. 3 days. This job paid $200 for 6 hours of being nothing. Worth it. Marcus moved down the line, barking instructions at other servers. Lakeisha returned to polishing water pitchers, her hands moving in familiar patterns. Polish, rinse, inspect, repeat. The crystal squeaked under her cloth, the sound sharp enough to make her teeth ache. "First summit?" Elena, an older server with kind eyes, whispered beside her. Lakeisha nodded. "Different from weddings. These men don't see us as people. We're functions, fixtures." Elena's voice dropped lower. "You hear things tonight. Deals, names, numbers. You forget them before your shift ends. Some knowledge isn't worth the price." Before Lakeisha could ask what she meant, the memories surfaced unbidden. Her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of tomato sauce and candlelight because the electricity had been shut off again. She'd been 8, maybe 9, tracing the grain in the wooden table while her grandmother's weathered hands held hers. "Ripeti dopo a mia, piccola," her grandmother had whispered. "Repeat after me, little one." The words that followed sounded like song and sorrow mixed together, syllables Lakeisha's young mouth struggled to shape. Her grandmother's grip tightened with each phrase, as though the language itself might slip away if she didn't hold on hard enough. "Why do I need to know this, Nona?" Lakeisha had asked in English, frustrated. "Nobody speaks like this anymore." Her grandmother's face had gone pale in the candlelight, her eyes suddenly ancient and afraid. "Because forgetting is how we disappear, mia cara. Promise me you'll remember, even when it makes no sense, even when it seems useless. Promise me." Lakeisha had promised, not understanding the urgency trembling in her grandmother's voice, the way the old woman's hands shook as she made her granddaughter repeat phrase after phrase until her throat hurt. 3 years later, her grandmother was gone. Heart attack. Alone in the same kitchen where she'd taught Lakeisha words no one else in their neighborhood had ever heard. The dialect died with her, or so Lakeisha thought. "Positions!" Marcus snapped, yanking her back to the present. "They're arriving." Lakeisha lifted her water pitcher, the crystal cold against her palms. Through the service entrance, she could see the summit guests settling into their seats, their conversations a low murmur of deal-making and power trading. She took her position near the wall, making herself part of the marble, part of the shadows, just furniture with a pulse. But as the main doors opened and a shift rippled through the hall like a stone dropped in still water, Lakeisha felt something she couldn't name, a pull, a whisper in a language she'd tried to forget. Her grandmother's voice, impossibly close. "Never forget, piccola mia, never forget." What Lakeisha didn't know was that in less than 10 minutes, those useless words her grandmother made her memorize would become the most dangerous thing she'd ever spoken. Hit subscribe button now if you want to see the moment a forgotten language brings a room of powerful men to their knees, because what happens next will prove that sometimes the things we bury don't stay dead. They wait. And tonight, Lakeisha's past is done waiting. The shift happened without warning. One moment, the summit hall buzzed with controlled conversation. The next, it fell into a silence so complete, Lakeisha could hear the crystal chandeliers trembling overhead. The main doors had opened. Jackson Smith didn't walk into the room. He arrived like weather, inevitable, transforming. His silver hair caught the light as he moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who'd never had to prove himself. The black suit he wore fit like it had been born on him, each line precise, each movement deliberate. His face carried the map of decisions most men would never have the stomach to make, deep lines around eyes that had witnessed things they'd never speak aloud. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every bodyguard in the hall straightened. Even the air seemed to hold itself differently. Behind Jackson walked his son. Don Thomas Smith was younger, broader, a coiled spring wrapped in a charcoal suit that couldn't quite hide what he was. Tattoos crept up his neck like vines reclaiming a monument, dark ink against skin that had seen violence and returned it with interest. His eyes moved constantly, scanning exits, counting threats, calculating angles. Where his father commanded through presence, Don Thomas warned through readiness. They moved together like predator and shadow, Jackson leading while Don Thomas guarded the space around him with the focus of someone who knew exactly how quickly power could bleed out. "Dear God," Marcus breathed beside Lakeisha, his clipboard trembling in his hands. "They actually came." Around them, the waitstaff exchanged glances that carried entire conversations. Lakeisha caught fragments of whispered panic. "Heard he owns half the ports between here and shipping empire, but that's just the surface. Everyone knows. Problems that money can't fix, that's when Don Thomas. Someone crossed him in Rotterdam. They never found the..." Elena appeared at Lakeisha's elbow, her kind eyes now hard with warning. "You're assigned to his table." The water pitcher nearly slipped from Lakeisha's hands. "What?" "Central table. You, me, and Carlos. No one else wanted it." Elena's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Listen to me carefully. You pour, you retreat. You do not let your hands shake where he can see them. Men like Jackson Smith can smell fear, and they interpret it as either weakness or guilt. You cannot afford to be either." Lakeisha's throat closed. The $200 she needed for this shift suddenly felt like blood money, payment for walking into a space where she fundamentally didn't belong. Jackson Smith took his seat at the central table with the kind of ease that came from knowing every sightline in the room had already been checked by men who'd die before they failed him. Don Thomas remained standing, positioned just behind his father's right shoulder, close enough to protect, far enough to survey. From across the hall, Lakeisha watched Don Thomas's
Good evening,
eyes
sir.
sweep the room with
Good evening.
mechanical
We
precision,
appreciate your respect.
cataloging faces, marking potential threats. When his gaze passed over the serving staff, it didn't pause. They weren't people to him, they were environmental factors, as relevant as the furniture. Marcus gripped Lakeisha's arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "You do not speak unless he addresses you directly. You do not make extended eye contact. You pour with your right hand, you step back with your left foot first, and you disappear. Do you understand me? You disappear." Lakeisha nodded, not trusting her voice. The water pitcher felt impossibly heavy as she lifted it, the crystal cold enough to burn. Her reflection rippled across its polished surface, a ghost of a girl playing at invisibility in a room full of men who made people vanish for real. "Just pour and leave," she told herself, the mantra steady even as her pulse hammered. "Don't speak, don't exist. You're nobody to them." But as she started across the marble floor toward the central table where Jackson Smith sat like a king who'd forgotten he wasn't supposed to wear the crown in public, Lakeisha felt her grandmother's words rising in her chest like floodwater. Words she'd tried to forget, words that suddenly felt like they'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Jackson Smith has spent 50 years burying secrets in graves deep enough that no one would ever find them, but in 60 seconds, Lakeisha is going to speak words that will crack those graves wide open. If you think you know where this is going, you don't. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me if you'd have the courage to serve a man who makes problems disappear, because what Lakeisha doesn't know is that she's about to become the biggest problem Jackson Smith has ever faced, and unlike the others, he can't make her disappear. Not this time. The walk to Jackson Smith's table felt like crossing a minefield in the dark. Lakeisha kept her eyes down, her breathing shallow. The water pitcher clutched in hands that had started trembling despite every effort to steady them. 3 steps, 2, 1. She reached the table. Her training kicked in automatically. Position the pitcher at a 45-degree angle, right hand steady, left hand supporting the base. pour without eye contact, retreat, disappear. But then Jackson looked up. Not the casual glance of someone acknowledging service, not the dismissive sweep of someone confirming a task was being performed. He looked at her the way someone looks at a photograph they'd thought was lost forever, suddenly found in an old drawer. His dark eyes locked onto her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. She felt stripped bare under that gaze, every carefully constructed layer of invisibility peeling away until she stood exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her body and everything to do with her soul. The moment stretched, lengthened. Around them, nearby conversations faltered as guests noticed the unusual stillness at the central table. Lakeisha's grandmother's voice rose in her memory, unbidden and impossibly clear. Not a memory, a presence, as though the old woman stood beside her, weathered hands guiding her own. Show respect to your elders, Piccola, always, even when they don't deserve it, especially then. The instinct hit her like a wave, drowning conscious thought. She bowed, slightly, the old way, the way her grandmother had taught her by candlelight in a kitchen that smelled of garlic and grief. And then she spoke. Buongiorno, signoruzzu. Sono qua per servirvi con rispetto e onori. The words left her mouth before she understood what she was doing. Ancient Sicilian, formal, the greeting used only for elders of status, men who commanded respect not through titles, but through bloodlines so old they'd forgotten their own origins. Good day, honored sir. I am here to serve you with respect and honor. The summit hall died. Conversations cut off mid-syllable. Crystal glasses froze halfway to mouths. 300 powerful men stopped breathing simultaneously, creating a vacuum of silence so complete Lakeisha could hear her own heart thundering in her ears. Jackson's expression didn't change, not externally, but his eyes widened fractionally, a flicker of shock so profound it bordered on pain. His hand, resting on the table, went rigid. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was staring at her like she'd risen from a grave he'd dug himself. Around the hall, bodyguards stiffened. Hands that had been relaxed at sides now hovered near jacket lapels, near concealed weapons. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, threat assessment protocols activating across the room like dominoes falling. Don Thomas moved. 1 second, he'd been standing behind his father, surveying the room with detached vigilance. The next, he was beside Lakeisha, his presence radiating barely controlled violence. His tattooed hand gripped the back of a chair, knuckles white with tension. "Where did you learn that?" His voice was low, dangerous, the kind of quiet that preceded explosions. "Answer me. Now." Lakeisha's throat closed. The water pitcher nearly slipped from her hands. The terror she'd been holding at bay crashed over her in a wave that left her dizzy. My grandmother, she taught me." "Your grandmother." Don Thomas stepped closer, invading her space with calculated intimidation. "What was her name? What village? Who were her people?" She never said. She just..." Lakeisha's voice cracked, words tumbling over themselves in panic. "She taught me prayers and greetings. She said to remember, but she never explained why." Jackson raised his hand. The gesture was small, barely noticeable, but Don Thomas stopped mid-breath, his interrogation cut off cleanly as if someone had severed his vocal cords. The hall remained frozen. No one moved. No one dared. Jackson stood slowly, his movements careful, controlled. He circled the table, his eyes never leaving Lakeisha's face. When he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, smell the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask something older, something like regret, he spoke. In Sicilian, the same dialect, testing her. Quali sono I parole che tua nonna t'insegnò? What are the words your grandmother taught you? Lakeisha's mouth moved automatically, answering in the language that had lived dormant in her memory for a decade. Preghiere, saluti, l'anciano modi. Prayers, greetings, the old ways. Jackson's face went pale. For the first time since entering the hall, his composure cracked. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out, then stopped, pulling back as though touching her might confirm a truth he couldn't bear to face. Impossibile, he whispered. Impossible. Lakeisha just spoke words that haven't existed outside a bloodline everyone believed was extinct. She doesn't know what she's done. She doesn't know that her grandmother carried a secret so dangerous it got people killed 50 years ago. And she doesn't know that Jackson Smith is staring at her like she's a ghost, because to him, she is. If you want to see what happens when a dead language resurrects a buried massacre, smash that subscribe button and comment below what you think Jackson is about to do, because Lakeisha's grandmother didn't teach her those words to honor the past. She taught them as a warning, and the warning just activated.
Jackson's hand remained raised, a silent command that held more authority than any spoken order could carry. Don Thomas stood frozen mid-interrogation, his tattooed fingers still gripping the chair back, tension radiating through his frame like a live wire. The fact that he'd stopped at all sent ripples of shock through the watching executives. Don Thomas Smith didn't defer. Not to politicians, not to corporate giants, not to men who thought their money made them untouchable. Only to his father. Jackson circled Lakeisha slowly, his footsteps deliberate against the marble floor. Each step felt like a countdown to something she couldn't name. When he spoke again, the Sicilian rolled off his tongue with the fluency of someone who'd been born to it. Quali preghiere t'insegnò tua nonna? Dicina. What prayers did your grandmother teach you? Tell me one. Lakeisha's voice trembled, but the words came. Muscle memory carved by candlelight in her grandmother's insistence. Matri betta, guidami. Proteggi li miei passi. Arricorda accusemu. Beautiful mother, guide me. Protect my steps. Remember who we are. Something broke in Jackson's expression, a hairline fracture in granite. His next question came faster, sharper. Lo simbolo. Quali simbolo t'insegnò? The symbol? What symbol did she teach you? Lakeisha didn't understand what he meant until her hand moved instinctively, tracing a pattern in the air her grandmother had made her practice until her fingers could form it in sleep. A specific gesture, fingers positioned in a way that made no sense outside the context of tradition. Jackson's breath caught audibly. Hocaniloro, he whispered. The candle holder. His eyes searched her face with desperate intensity, looking for features that matched a memory he tried to bury. Quali storia ti contavo a proposito? What story did she tell you about it? She switched back to English, her voice barely above a whisper. She said it represented the light that survived when everything else burned, that as long as someone remembered to make the sign, the family wasn't truly gone. The hall had gone beyond silent. It had become a held breath. 300 people trapped in a moment they didn't understand, but instinctively recognized as dangerous. Jackson moved closer, close enough that Lakeisha could see moisture gathering in his eyes, tears he refused to let fall. Como si chiamava tua nonna? What was your grandmother's name? Maria Costantino. The name landed like a gunshot. Jackson staggered back a step, his composure finally shattering. His hand went to his chest as though checking for a wound. Don Thomas moved immediately to his father's side, gripping his elbow, but Jackson waved him off with a shaking hand. Costantino, Jackson repeated, his voice breaking on the syllables. Santa Madre di Dio. Holy Mother of God. Don Thomas's jaw tightened, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. He looked at Lakeisha with new assessment, no longer seeing a waitress, but a problem that rewrote everything he thought he knew about his father's past. Jackson reached into his jacket, a movement that made bodyguards throughout the hall tense, and withdrew a handkerchief, not to wipe his eyes, but to press against his mouth as though holding back words that wanted to escape. When he spoke again, it was in English, his voice raw. Your grandmother, Maria, did she have a scar here? He touched his left temple, shaped like a crescent moon. Lakeisha's knees weakened. Yes, she said it was from falling as a child, but she never wanted anyone to see it. She always covered it with her hair. She lied. Jackson's words were barely audible. She didn't fall. She got it the night her village burned, the night I watched her family die and did nothing to stop it. The confession hung in the air like smoke from an old fire. Around them, the summit dissolved into irrelevance. Billion-dollar deals and international negotiations meant nothing compared to the weight of this moment. A man confronting the ghost of a sin he'd carried for half a century. And Lakeisha, standing at the center of it all, finally understanding why her grandmother had gripped her hands so tightly in that candlelit kitchen. Because forgetting wasn't just about losing language, it was about letting the dead stay buried when they deserved to be remembered. Jackson Smith just admitted to witnessing a massacre he never stopped. Lakeisha's grandmother survived something so horrific she hid it for 50 years, teaching her granddaughter a language like planting evidence in a time capsule. If you think this is just about family history, you're wrong. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments if you'd want to know the truth about your grandmother's scars, because what Lakeisha is about to learn will destroy the only thing she has left, the memory of the woman who raised her. And some truths don't set you free, they bury you alive.
Jackson's voice cut through the silence with terrible quiet. Leave. One word. No explanation, no justification. The summit guests rose from their chairs like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. Executives worth billions gathered their jackets without protest. Bodyguards holstered weapons that had half emerged from concealment. Within 3 minutes, the grand marble hall that had held 300 of the world's most powerful men now echoed with emptiness. No one questioned the order. Not even men who'd built empires on the principle that they bowed to no one. Because Jackson Smith's authority didn't come from volume. It came from the certainty that defiance carried consequences they couldn't afford to discover. The doors closed with a sound like a tomb sealing. Lakeisha stood alone in the vast space, her water pitcher still clutched in white-knuckled hands, surrounded by marble columns that suddenly felt less like architecture and more like witness to something she desperately wanted to unsee. Jackson lowered himself into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose body had started keeping score of every violent thing he'd witnessed. For the first time since entering the hall, he looked his age. Every line in his face a tally mark of choices that couldn't be undone. He gestured to the chair beside him. Sit. Not a command, an invitation, the kind offered to equals, not servants. Lakeisha's legs trembled as she moved, setting the pitcher down with a soft clink that echoed like breaking glass. She sat on the edge of the chair, unable to fully commit to the space, still half convinced this was a test she'd already failed. Don Thomas remained standing, positioning himself where he could see both the entrance and his father's face. His arms crossed over his chest, tattooed hands visible and tense. She could feel his gaze cataloging her features, searching for threat assessment in the curve of her jaw, the shape of her eyes. Jackson pulled in a breath that sounded like it hurt. The Costantino family, he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades,
were not mafia. They were something older, respected arbiters. When families went to war, the Costantinos stood neutral ground, sacred ground. Their word carried weight because they'd never chosen a side in 500 years of bloodshed. Lakeisha's throat constricted. Her grandmother's name, Costantino, suddenly felt less like identity and more like inheritance of something she'd never consented to carry. In 1974, territorial conflicts in Sicily reached a breaking point. Old families fighting new money, traditional codes breaking down. Someone decided neutrality was the same as weakness. Jackson's hands curled into fists on the table. They burned the Costantino village on a Sunday morning, during Mass, locked the church doors from the outside. Lakeisha's vision blurred. She could smell it suddenly, not the memory, but the ghost of what her grandmother must have carried. Smoke, burning wood, the kind of terror that branded itself into DNA and passed down through generations. How many? The question left her lips before she could stop it. 43. Jackson's voice broke on the number. Men, women, children, the entire bloodline, they thought. They were thorough. Don Thomas shifted, his jaw working like he was trying to physically contain words that wanted to escape. This was history his father had never shared, secrets that rewrote the foundation of everything he thought he knew. But they weren't thorough enough, Lakeisha whispered, understanding crystallizing like ice in her chest. My grandmother survived. Maria survived. Jackson's eyes met hers, and she saw grief there so profound it had calcified into something harder than guilt. She was 16, pulled from the rubble by someone who took pity, smuggled out of Sicily before the families could confirm the kill count. He paused, his voice dropping to barely audible. I was there that day, 20 years old, part of a different family's security detail. We watched the smoke rise, we knew what was happening, and we did nothing. The confession landed between them like a body. You let them die. Lakeisha's voice didn't sound like her own. I let them burn. Jackson's correction was precise, surgical, and I've carried that fire in my chest for 50 years. Jackson Smith built an empire on the foundation of a massacre he witnessed and did nothing to stop. Lakeisha's grandmother spent her entire life hiding from the truth, teaching her granddaughter a language like leaving breadcrumbs for a reckoning she knew would come. Subscribe and hit the notification bell if you want to see what happens when the daughter of survivors demands answers from the man who could have saved them. Because what Lakeisha asks next will force Jackson to choose between the empire he built and the redemption he doesn't deserve. And some debts can only be paid in truth, even when the truth destroys everyone left alive. Why? Lakeisha's voice cracked on the single syllable. Why did they want them dead? What could a family of arbiters possibly do to deserve that? Jackson's face turned to stone, but his eyes betrayed him, ancient pain surfacing like bones exposed by erosion. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he asked his own. When did Maria come to America? 1975, I think. Maybe 76. She never gave me exact dates. Lakeisha's hands twisted in her lap. She arrived alone, worked in a restaurant in Brooklyn, barely spoke English. Her voice caught. She never talked about Sicily, not once, just taught me the dialect in whispers like someone might overhear and punish her for it. Did she ever mention family? Anyone who came with her? Anyone she left behind? Lakeisha shook her head, tears beginning to blur her vision. She said she had no one, that I was all she had left after my mother died. I thought the loneliness was normal, immigrants losing touch with the old country. I didn't know she meant everyone was dead. The word hung between them like an accusation. Jackson closed his eyes. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of 43 names he'd probably memorized, faces he'd seen in smoke and never forgotten.
Good evening, sir.
When he spoke again,
Good evening.
his voice
We
carried the
appreciate your
texture of
respect.
gravel and regret. Your grandmother didn't lose touch with the old country, Lakeisha. She ran from it. She built a new life, brick by brick, scrubbing floors and serving people who'd never know what kind of hell she'd crawled out of. She raised you in silence because silence was the only armor she had left. He opened his eyes, and they glistened with unshed tears. And she taught you the dialect because she knew. Somewhere deep in her bones, she knew that one day, someone would need proof that the Costantino family didn't die in that fire. Proof for what? Lakeisha's voice rose, desperation bleeding through. What difference does it make now? Everyone's gone. The village is gone. My grandmother is gone. What does any of this matter? Don Thomas shifted, his voice cutting in sharp and cold. It matters because if the families who ordered that massacre learn a Costantino survived, they'll finish what they started. Old vendettas don't die just because the calendar changes. They wait and they remember. Let them remember. Jackson's words landed like a hammer. He turned to his son, and Lakeisha saw something she hadn't expected, defiance born of guilt that had fermented into something harder. What was done to the Costantinos wasn't strategy, it wasn't business, it was butchery disguised as necessity. And I watched it happen from a hillside half a mile away, binoculars in my hand, and I did nothing. The confession tore out of him like shrapnel. I was 20 years old, following orders from men I thought I owed loyalty to. They told us the Costantinos had chosen a side, broken their neutrality, become a threat that needed eliminating. So we watched. We provided perimeter security. We made sure no one interfered while that church burned. Lakeisha's stomach turned. She could see it. Young Jackson, barely more than a boy himself, standing watch while children screamed behind locked doors. And when it was over, Jackson continued, his voice breaking apart, when the smoke cleared and the families counted the bodies, I told myself it was necessary, that I'd done my duty, that the Costantinos must have done something to deserve it. Lakeisha looked directly at Lakeisha. But I never believed it, not for 1 second. I've carried those screams in my head for 50 years, and I will carry them to my grave. Don Thomas's jaw worked, processing information that rewrote his understanding of his father. You never told me. I've never told anyone. Jackson wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so human it made him look fragile. Until now. Lakeisha felt something break open in her chest. Grief for a grandmother who'd carried unspeakable trauma in silence. Rage at a world where powerful men watched children burn and called it business. And a terrible, aching understanding of why her grandmother's hands had shaken every time she made Lakeisha repeat those prayers. Because Maria Costantino had known. She had known that silence protected the living, but betrayed the dead. So she planted words in her grandmother's memory like seeds in scorched earth, trusting that someday, somehow, they'd grow into testimony. Jackson Smith is crying in front of the daughter of the woman he failed to save, and he just told her the truth powerful men have killed to keep buried. Lakeisha now knows her grandmother didn't die of a broken heart. She died carrying the names of 43 people who burned alive while men with binoculars watched. Drop a comment if you think Jackson deserves forgiveness, and smash that subscribe button to see what Lakeisha does with this truth, because she has a choice now. She can bury it again like her grandmother did, or she can make Jackson answer for every scream he's carried for 50 years. And forgiveness? Forgiveness is for people who didn't let children burn.
Don Thomas's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. This is a liability we cannot afford. He wasn't looking at Lakeisha when he said it. He was looking at his father, speaking the language of men who solved problems with efficiency rather than mercy. She knows too much now. She's connected to history that powerful families paid to erase. The moment word spreads that a Costantino survived, he stopped, recalculating. We have options: financial compensation, relocation under a new identity, or no. Jackson's voice carried the finality of a door slamming shut. Don Thomas's jaw tightened. Father, be reasonable. Sentiment doesn't. She is under my protection. Jackson stood, and despite his age, despite the tremor in his hands from confession that had cost him something irreplaceable, his presence filled the hall with unmovable authority. That is not a negotiation. That is a declaration. This creates exposure. Don Thomas stepped closer, his voice dropping to the frustrated urgency of a son watching his father make a catastrophic mistake. Questions we can't answer, investigations we can't control. The families who ordered that massacre aren't all dead. Some of their children run empires now. If they learn a Costantino heir exists, then they learn. Jackson's interruption landed like a physical blow. And if they come for her, they come through me first. The air between father and son crackled with tension that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the collision of pragmatism and penance. She carries the Costantino name, Jackson continued, his voice dropping to something quieter but infinitely more dangerous. I cannot undo the past. I cannot bring back the 43 people who burned while I stood on a hillside and did nothing. But I will not. His voice broke, then steadied with terrible resolve. I will not let another Costantino disappear because powerful men found it convenient. Don Thomas stared at his father, seeing something he'd never witnessed before. Jackson Smith choosing honor over survival, principle over pragmatism. The calculation in his eyes shifted, recalibrating decades of assumptions about what his father valued most. Slowly, he nodded. Not agreement, acceptance. Jackson turned to Lakeisha, and she saw the weight of 50 years of guilt trying to transmute into something that might resemble redemption. You will not return to serving tables, he said, his voice gentle now, almost fatherly. You will be protected. My people will watch over you. But understand, this protection comes with a price, visibility. People will ask questions. They will investigate. They will dig into your grandmother's past and your connection to me. You will never be invisible again. Lakeisha felt the enormity of the choice settle onto her shoulders. Invisibility had been her survival strategy for 28 years. It had kept her safe, kept her employed, kept her from being noticed by people who might hurt her. But invisibility had also been a cage, a denial of the bloodline that ran through her veins, a betrayal of the grandmother who'd carried unspeakable trauma in silence so that Lakeisha might live free. She met Jackson's eyes, and when she spoke, her voice didn't shake. I'm done being invisible. The words landed in the vast empty hall like a vow spoken in a cathedral. Jackson's face transformed. The hard lines softened. The guilt-carved features shifted into something that might have been pride. A smile ghosted across his mouth, small, genuine, the first real expression of anything resembling peace she'd seen on his face. Your grandmother would be proud, he whispered. And Lakeisha realized with a jolt that felt like lightning through her chest. She believed him. Maria Costantino spent 50 years teaching her granddaughter a language that would one day become a weapon, a shield, a testimony. She planted words in Lakeisha's memory like time bombs set to detonate at precisely this moment. Because Maria knew. She knew that silence protected the living but erased the dead. And she refused to let 43 people burn twice, once in fire, once in forgetting. Don Thomas pulled out his phone, his movements precise and controlled. I'll assign a security detail. 2 men, rotating shifts. They'll maintain distance but stay close enough to respond to threats. No, Lakeisha said. Both men looked at her. No bodyguards that I can see. I don't want to live like I'm waiting for someone to kill me. She held Jackson's gaze. You said protection. I want information. I want to know everything about what happened to my family. Every name, every detail. My grandmother died without telling me the truth. You owe me that much. Jackson's eyes glistened. You'll have it. All of it. Even the parts that will hurt. Especially those, Lakeisha corrected. Lakeisha just went from invisible waitress to protected heir in under an hour, and she demanded the one thing Jackson Smith has spent 50 years trying to bury, the complete, unfiltered truth.
Hit that like button if you think she deserves answers, and subscribe to see what happens when the granddaughter of massacre survivors learns exactly who gave the order to burn that church, because one of those men is still alive, and he's been watching this entire conversation. Comment below if you'd want to know who killed your family, even if the truth destroyed everything you thought you knew about survival.
The doors opened and the summit guests filed back into the hall like actors returning to a stage where the script had been rewritten without their knowledge. They settled into their seats with careful precision, eyes darting toward the central table where Jackson sat with the composed stillness of a man who just confessed to decades-old sins and somehow survived the unburdening. The conversations that resumed carried a different texture now, quieter, more cautious, threaded through with questions no one dared ask aloud. What had happened in that cleared hall? Who was the waitress? Why had Jackson Smith, a man whose emotional range typically spanned from controlled to completely controlled, looked like he'd been crying? Lakeisha stood near the marble column where she'd positioned herself hours ago, but everything had changed. She wasn't holding a water pitcher. She wasn't keeping her head down. She stood upright, shoulders back, meeting the curious stares with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Don Thomas appeared at her side, his presence less threatening now and more protective. He gestured subtly, and two men in crisp blue suits materialized from the periphery. They positioned themselves at a respectful distance, close enough to intervene, far enough to give her space. "Marco and Stevens," Don Thomas said, his voice carrying none of the earlier hostility. "They'll maintain a perimeter. You won't always see them, but they'll be there." Lakeisha nodded, still processing the surreal shift from invisible labor to protected asset in the span of an hour. Marcus, the event coordinator, approached with the kind of confusion that comes from watching reality reorganize itself without permission. "Miss, should I?" He couldn't complete a sentence, his carefully ordered world having collapsed into questions he had no framework to answer. "She's leaving," Don Thomas said simply, "through the main entrance. Not the service corridor, not the back exit where waitstaff disappeared into the city without acknowledgement. The main entrance, where power walked." The hall went quiet as Lakeisha moved toward the doors, her two blue-suited shadows flanking her at a professional distance. Every executive, every businessman, every person who dismissed her as furniture just hours ago now watched her passage with the kind of attention reserved for people who mattered. They didn't know her name, they didn't know her story, but they knew, with the instinct that comes from living in worlds where power dynamics shift like tides, that something fundamental had changed. Jackson met her at the entrance. He pressed a card into her hand, his weathered fingers closing over hers for just a moment, a gesture that carried more weight than any contract. You call if you need anything, information, protection, someone to listen when the weight of what you've learned becomes too much to carry alone. Lakeisha looked down at the card, simple, black, just a phone number embossed in silver. No name, no title, the kind of card given to people who already knew exactly who they were calling. "You're not alone anymore," Jackson said, and his eyes held a promise that felt like penance and protection braided together. Her hands didn't tremble as she tucked the card into her pocket. The late afternoon air hit her face as she stepped onto the street, Marco and Stevens maintaining their discreet formation. The city looked exactly as it had when she'd arrived for her shift. Taxis honking, pedestrians rushing, buildings reaching toward a sky that didn't care about the small human dramas unfolding in their shadows. But Lakeisha wasn't the same person who'd walked into that marble cathedral 6 hours ago, desperate for $200 to delay an eviction notice. She was a Costantino, the last living heir to a bloodline that powerful men had tried to erase with fire and silence. And she was done pretending that invisibility was the same thing as safety. Lakeisha just walked out of that summit as a completely different person, protected by men who eliminate problems for a living, carrying the private number of a man who watched her family burn. But here's what she doesn't know yet. Her grandmother didn't just survive that massacre. Maria Costantino witnessed something that night, so dangerous she took it to her grave. And Jackson Smith is about to tell Lakeisha exactly what her grandmother saw. Subscribe now and comment if you think Lakeisha can handle the truth, because what she learns next will make her wish she'd stayed invisible. Some secrets don't set you free, they make you a target. The apartment door closed behind Lakeisha with the same hollow click it had made 1,000 times before. But tonight, the sound felt different, final somehow, like sealing a tomb on a version of herself that no longer existed. The studio looked exactly as she'd left it. Worn couch with the spring that poked through the left cushion, kitchenette with the faucet that dripped no matter how tightly she turned it, secondhand dresser she'd found on the curb 3 years ago. The eviction notice still sat on the counter, its threat now feeling almost quaint compared to the revelations that had detonated her understanding of who she was. She set down her bag and stood in the center of the small space, seeing it through new eyes. This wasn't just poverty. This was the inheritance her grandmother had built, invisibility as architecture, erasure as safety strategy. The cardboard box sat on the top shelf of her closet, exactly where it had lived since her grandmother's funeral. Lakeisha had packed it once and never opened it again, the grief too sharp, the memories too painful. Now she lifted it down with trembling hands. Inside, a rosary with wooden beads worn smooth by decades of desperate prayers. Faded photographs of a young woman Lakeisha barely recognized as the grandmother who'd raised her. Maria at 20, her face unlined, her eyes not yet carved hollow by survivor's guilt. A handkerchief, delicate lace edged in blue thread, embroidered with initials in the corner. M.C. Maria Costantino. Lakeisha's fingers traced the letters her grandmother had stitched before everything burned, before survival became a language spoken in silence, before a 16-year-old girl learned that living meant forgetting everyone you loved. She pulled out the largest photograph, her grandmother at 70, near the end. The camera had caught her in the kitchen, hands dusted with flour, eyes looking directly at the lens with an expression Lakeisha had always read as sadness. But now she understood. It wasn't sadness, it was knowledge, the weight of carrying 43 names in your chest, like shrapnel you could never remove because extracting it would mean forgetting they'd ever existed. "You taught me their language," Lakeisha whispered to the photograph, tears streaming down her face. "You gave me their words because you knew someday I'd need to prove they were real, that we were real." Her grandmother had died alone in that kitchen, heart giving out while she kneaded dough for bread Lakeisha would never taste. The paramedics said it was quick, painless, but Lakeisha knew better now. Her grandmother had been dying slowly for 50 years, carrying the weight of a massacre she'd survived by accident of being outside the church when the doors were locked. She'd lived with the guilt of breathing while everyone she loved burned. And she'd transformed that guilt into purpose, teaching her granddaughter a dialect that would one day become testimony, planting words in Lakeisha's memory like seeds in scorched earth, trusting they'd bloom into recognition. Lakeisha pulled out her phone with shaking hands. The black card Jackson had given her sat on the counter. She typed the number, then hesitated over the message. What do you say to the man who watched your family die and did nothing?
What do you say to the man who just gave you protection he should have given them 50 years ago? Finally, she typed, "Thank you for seeing me." The response came within minutes, as though Jackson had been waiting, phone in hand, for her to reach out. Your grandmother would be proud. Lakeisha's vision blurred. She clutched the phone to her chest, the photograph of Maria pressed against her heart, and let herself break open with grief that was 50 years overdue. Because Maria Costantino had spent her entire life being invisible, working jobs where no one asked her name, living in apartments where no one knew her story, raising a granddaughter she loved enough to lie to, protecting her with silence because silence was the only weapon she had.
But invisibility had been a cage, and Maria had known it. So she'd given Lakeisha the key, words in a language that powerful men thought they'd erased, words that would one day freeze a room full of dangerous power and prove that some things refuse to stay buried. Lakeisha walked into that summit as nobody, cheap labor, disposable help. She left as living proof that genocide only works if everyone forgets. And Maria Costantino had refused to let her family be forgotten twice. Lakeisha's grandmother died keeping secrets that almost destroyed her granddaughter's chance at knowing the truth, but she also died knowing she'd planted a weapon in Lakeisha's memory, a language that would one day demand accountability from men who thought they'd gotten away with murder. If this story made you cry, hit that like button. If you think some truths are worth carrying even when they hurt, subscribe and comment below to tell me, would you want to know the truth about your family, even if it meant learning your grandmother had survived something so horrific she could never speak of it? Because this isn't just Lakeisha's story, it's every immigrant's story, every survivor's story, every person who carries the voice of ghosts and refuses to let them be forgotten. Share this if you believe memory is resistance, and may we all be brave enough to speak the languages our grandmothers taught us, even when the world wants us to forget.